Well, it was an honor to have you. Amidst, by the way, the financial crisis at the time, it was really in the aftermath of that we began.
It's always something.
We began having these conversations. One of the reasons I wanted to spend time with you is because you are the outgoing CEO, now the senior chairman of Goldman Sachs, and I thought what we could do is take some time to learn from you and to think about some of the things that have happened over the past, well,
millennium.
13 years. So here's where I wanted to start this conversation. You became the CEO of Goldman when you were 51 years old, I believe. If you go back and look, it's
2006. So
should be 51.
51.
We had a card under people's chairs this morning. People had different questions they could ask each other, and one of the questions was, "What would your 8-year-old self think of you now?" And so one of the questions I was going to ask you is, what do you think the 51-year-old version of you going into this job would have thought of everything that happened afterwards?
Well, if you ask me what would I think of where I am today as opposed to the stream of things, I'd say there's nothing I went into where I wasn't just really hoping that I would be okay and do a good job. I mean, I know that there's people who have a lot of more bravado than I do about that. And so I'm just relieved that I had a long tenure. The place is in really good shape. The people I worked with appreciated me, and believe me, that's what I would be quite relieved about.
We talked a long time about when is the time to leave, and it always feels like never is the right time.
It's always never, which is why a lot of people don't leave on their own power, because they either leave too late or they get help in leaving. And I said this in I wrote a little departure note, and I said, when things are going badly, you can't leave, and when things are going well, you don't want to leave. But that's the only time you can really leave on your own initiative. And so the ambivalence about leaving is going to be baked in the cake. And that's it. And if you look at the people in corporate America today, and I read a lot of history, a lot of biographies, I know the risk was staying too long. And there were not a lot of windows over the last 13 years when it felt as halcyon and the runway felt as clear as it does today. And it happened to also be contemporaneous with having a good successor.
I want to talk about that successor and what that runway looks like in a second. I had come to visit with you and David literally the day that this transition was taking place, if you recall, or that it was going to be announced. And I'd asked you to grade yourself. And you said this. You said, at the end of the day, the firm during my tenure faced existential risk in terms of the first half of the financial crisis.
Right.
And extraordinary reputational risk, which came about partially because we navigated the existential risk as well as we did.
Okay, that sounds like an intelligent thing.
What did you mean by that?
I mean, at the first part of the crisis, when everybody was anxious, nobody knew what anybody's solvency was. And if you were really, really good shape and you were positive and you stood on a chair and announced that to the world, they really thought you were in trouble. And so there was no good moment. So everybody was navigating initially for the existential risk of it, and it would have been everybody. I always use the metaphor. There were many more weak firms. Some of those firms succumbed, and some of them had to do extraordinary things to avoid succumbing. But at the end of the day, what happens in a financial crisis is nobody knows what anybody's worth. So everybody is expecting delivery of the money they're owed, and very, very slow to give out the money they owe someone else. So what happens is money is not coming in, but you're obligated to send money out if you're in the financial system. And so everybody was exposed to that kind of existential risk. Having gotten through that, we had the reputational part. And the reputational part for us, I think, was related to, went from the initial part was with respect to, how well we did in the initial part of the financials was a little bit of how did you do it? As if it were, as a virtuous thing. And then after it was, well, how did you do it? If you hedge, that means you sold these things. Who did you sell them to? Well, I said, we sold them because it's our protocol. If we're buying stuff, we sell them. Other institutions at that period had huge inventories of AAA securities that weren't valuable. We would buy them and sell them and buy them and sell them and eventually made ourselves flat. But we got caught in a juggernaut of people who said, it's very funny. You wrote a book on this period and other people have written books. There were two themes in the book that are contradictory that when they write about this. It either was bankers are so stupid they didn't even understand the risks, or bankers were too clever by half and understand them so well they were able to perpetrate this on unsuspecting others. The answer is, for us, we weren't too smart, weren't too dumb, we just manage our risk to a very low level every day.
What would have you done differently, given the headlines about the vampire squid? Given
After acquired information, everything I would have done different. Anybody who doesn't change in response to after acquired information would be crazy. I wouldn't have bought any CDOs from anybody.
But given what happened, in terms of the crisis piece of this, what do you think you would have done differently? I mean, as I said, there were headlines about the vampire squid. There was the God comment, doing God's work. I don't know if you know where you think that lies. But there was a sense
Well, he and I have discussed it, and we decided that we're going to let it go. I think this brings up and leads into a point. Not so much, here's what I wish I had done differently before the crisis as a predicate issue. We had as part, you know, it was in the culture of Goldman Sachs, the pre-existing culture of the Goldman Sachs, we never spoke to the press. We had a personnel department, which you'd appreciate, whose objective was to keep people away from us, not to invite people in. We very rarely, if ever, went on television. We didn't realize that. Our mantra was our clients should have the exposure, not us. We're in the background. That hurt us a lot because when the crisis struck, in the absence of a narrative about us, I would be reading about the firm and myself as if I was some 19th century plutocrat. And that's not my personality. I grew up in Brooklyn in the projects, so that's not us. And so in the absence of us defining what the firm does, what the firm's ethics are, what its character, what our current people do, what our alumni do, people fill that in. I don't think after 12 years as CEO and with the exposure I've had post the crisis, if I said to a reporter, can't stop and talk now, I'm off to do God's work, I don't think it would today be taken as an ecclesiastical statement as it was then. But that's really literally what happened in those days. So if I have a regret, I think we had the burden of not having exposure or being known.
Let me ask you one other. Hank Paulson, former CEO of your firm, who then became the Treasury Secretary, had said to me in September on the 10-year anniversary of the crisis, he said, I wish they hadn't given out the bonuses the way they did in 2009.
No. You know, 2009 was a great performance year for the firm, and I understand the political environment and the social environment, and I could tell you the senior people in the firm who had some control over what they did was on board with that, as you know, didn't take bonuses, but I only work at the firm. I'm not allowed, it's not my firm. I can't ruin it if I want to. And if you don't pay people what they're owed, they're not going to stay. And it might have been a grand gesture, and it certainly would have helped me. And by the way, financially made no difference to me given what we did to ourselves in the senior-most office. But it's not my firm to kill, even if I were willing to make that calculation. And so, believe me, I understood the consequences of that the headlines of us having paid him or doing anything would have drawn out. But I'll tell you, it wasn't going to get much better for us given the circumstances and in terms reputationally with respect to that issue. And it would have been a hell of a lot worse if we lost the essence, if we lost our staff because they thought there was no career and that we had violated our contractual norms to them.
Okay, let me ask you a different question. And this relates to the culture of the firm. One of the things about Goldman that has arguably been very special about the firm for a very long time is the number of people who ultimately leave and go into public service, ultimately government. Yeah. And you've seen it with so many, and we all know,
in the United States
know those
and outside
names.
the United States, right.
Do you think in the end that has actually helped the firm, given the optics of all of this?
If you take the whole big picture, of course it helps the firm. If you take this event and this situation where people were mad at government and we were government Sachs, and it became a pejorative to want to go into public service, of course it didn't help us in that context. But the kind of people we recruit for the firm and that we want to join us are the kind of people who think who think who think about the world and think about improving the context. We don't create them that way. They're a little bit like that when they come in, and that's the pool that we recruit from. And when people can see what kinds of careers they have at Goldman, let's say we take in 4,000 people every year. They go through a machine, and after 15 or 20 years, we make 60 or 70 partners. Somewhere along the line, a bunch of people leave this place, leave Goldman. And so people can see what kinds of careers they can have at Goldman, but I think it's very helpful to the firm when people can see that their post-Goldman Sachs careers can go and do the kinds of things that they want to have to be influential and make a positive impact on the world. Could that be bad for us?
Well, let me ask you a separate question, because this does deal with the optics, which is that not only do people go into public service, but the company, and others on Wall Street do this as well, they incentivize it, right? Because they will, for example, in Gary Cohen's case, or in so many different cases.
The government incentivizes it. What do you mean?
No, that Goldman incentivizes it going in, because they will effectively vest shares and people can get paid.
No, well, that's not intended to be an incentive. It's intended to remove the punitive aspect of going into government service. So a person who goes into government service, I know there's certain people out there who would think, people who don't like business interests to be represented in government would say, we pay so much of our money out to people in deferred comp. That's a function of what we always wanted to do, but that's been rammed in by regulators, and frankly, the good governance people really want people's committed for a long time. So when anybody leaves our company, they have outstanding stock, some cases 6, 7, 8 years worth of stock that are accumulating that should be paid off over time. If you go into a government job and you have a single big stock position, putting that position in a blind trust doesn't really do much for you, especially because they can't sell it because it's restricted. What we do is we let them out of the position. Otherwise, they couldn't go into government service. It's their money. We don't give them the money. It was
They're not getting any additional money. And the reason I asked...
They're not getting any additional money. They just don't have to lose that money.
But they would lose that money if they went to a competitor, if they went to go be a teacher, for example?
Yeah, but that's for our benefit, not their benefit. We don't want them to go to work for a competitor, but we have no bias against them going into government service.
If I wanted to go be a photographer or a painter, you wouldn't allow it. The reason I ask is this.
If we were they would just play out over time. It comes from the government that they're not allowed to hold their stock, not from us.
So when you hear the AFL-CIO...
If the President of the United States wanted to be a long-term shareholder of Goldman Sachs, God bless you. I'm not telling him he can't own our stock. The rules of government say he can't hold our stock. So they could either have a choice of selling the stock, which they're not allowed to do unless we release them, or else not accepting a job in government.
So there's no additional vesting of stock, just to be clear on this. When Gary Cohen, for example, left the firm, there was some money that vested that he would have otherwise lost had he gone and decided to be a photographer.
I believe he was vested because he met the vesting requirements. Maybe there are non-compete rules, and this is complicated stuff. I don't think he got any extra dollar benefit, except to the extent that to otherwise take that job and lose a lot of stuff and forego stuff was a cost that we didn't make him endure. Okay. So that's a benefit.
Let me ask you...
The benefit that somebody gets from going into the government comes from the government, which is the tax deferral. Which we don't do. That's the government does that.
We can talk more about that. Let me ask you about Gary Cohen, just because I think there's an interest. How do you look at his tenure in Washington? You spent a long time with him.
Well, I won't tell you how he looks at it. I'll tell you how I look at it. You can ask him how he looks at it. I think he went into a situation... I think he was imbued with the same spirit that my last 5 predecessors who went into the government were imbued with, and a lot of other people at Goldman Sachs. And he left a job that paid a lot of money and into something that didn't pay very much money. And in fact, I think he was a $1 a year guy anyway. And where you're going to get a lot of lambasting in the press. It was still a moment in time when no one knew how the government was going to play out. In other words, no one knew what a Trump presidency was going to look like, so maybe he thought differently from the way it turned out. And he went out there and he did a couple of things that needed to be done. And I'd say, on the whole, my assessment is that it was entirely a positive for the stuff that he got done, but also for him personally.
Let me ask you this, and just to settle a debate that's been out there. Was Gary ever really your successor in all of this? There's a view that when he left because he knew he was not getting the job.
I'd say the job wasn't up for grabs at that time, and the successor is taken by the board, and it never got to that.
Okay.
The successor is named by the board. I think his leaving coincided with a new administration, and he may have made a calculation, but it wouldn't have been with certainty. It would have been, he might have thought of the probabilities at that time, but I hadn't done him the favor of telling him when I was leaving at that point.
Let's talk about David Solomon, your chosen successor, and some of the moves he's already made to move the firm more towards the consumer, to the consumer business than before. And he's moved fast. Do you
Well, he moved so fast that they all happened 2 years ago, but that was very fast. I mean, how fast do you think those moves had taken place?
Well, I guess my question, though, to you was going to be, do you wish that you had moved on some of those things faster yourself?
Look, what David will do will play out over time. This is November 1st. My first day not CEO was October 1st. So, of the same year, by the way.
Right.
So I would say that everything that you're seeing play out is something that wouldn't have been done without my complicity, at least, and my driving. And in the last several years, David and I were so close, and from the moment I recognized him as my successor, he certainly wasn't doing anything without and for that part, if I was doing something for the long term, at the very least, I'd explain it to him and give him a chance to refute it. I think we've been pretty similar. Look, there are going to be differences with us, with different styles. You know, he rides a bike. I like to go swimming. He's taller. I'm short. We're both bald. He's a DJ. I'm a JD. You know, there are differences, but you know something. Like, to paraphrase from Mark Twain, we're not the same, but we rhyme.
Let me ask you this. There's a headline today, which I do need to ask you about, that actually broke while we were here. This relates to two Goldman Sachs investment bankers that were charged with money laundering on this one IMBD case. There's a book all about it, Billion Dollar Whale. The movie Wolf of Wall Street was financed by that sovereign wealth fund that was turned into a scam. What do you think it means to the reputation of the firm?
Well, it's not good. I mean, what does it mean? It's not positive. We're going to have to go and know more about this. You know, we're fully cooperating in the investigation. There was obviously at least one person, two under the under what came out today, that were clearly violating our rules and keeping us from this. So we don't have the facts, all the facts that were the predicate of the indictment. In other words, they have access to more information. They have access to people and cell phones and tapes and stuff. And so we're trying to get information on it. So if I had it, I'd tell you it was an ongoing investigation. I really couldn't comment, but I don't even have it, to be perfectly honest. But I'd say we're, you know, when we see bad behavior, we jump on it and act on it. And
there were reports, though, that senior management, there were red flags on this beforehand. Fair?
You know something, I'm not aware of them, but I'm not in a position to refute facts that I don't have a complete picture of and haven't been presented. I mean, we've asked for this information also, and we don't have it. And so I can't say, if I looked at it, I can't say how I'd react to it.
But is your sense...
But my bias and from where I'm coming from, knowing what we deploy in compliance and how scrupulous we are, I would say that we're pretty compliant. But here in this case, at the very least, and this part I know, one of our people lied to us and evaded our systems and our controls and avoided the tests we make of some of our controls, which somebody can do and has happened from time to time. Every few years, there's somebody who trades on insider information. The government finds that person, and we don't find that person because they have other access and views. I'm not trying to conflate the two because this person was much more senior than in the most recent case that I'm referring to. But if I had more, I'd give it to you, but I don't.
Fair enough. I want to have two final questions, and I want to open it up. You have, dare I say, trolled President Trump to some degree on Twitter before.
Dare you not say that.
But here's what I wanted to ask you about, and we've also been talking about what happened in Pittsburgh.
I've kidded the president.
You've kidded the president on Twitter, but here's what I want to ask you. Given the shooting in Pittsburgh, President Trump ran an ad during his campaign about what he called globalists. And there are only 3 pictures that he used during those commercials. You were one of them. George Soros was another. Janet Yellen was another, all Jewish.
Pretty good company.
You know, in the past, you've laughed a lot of this off, and we've had these conversations before. But I'm curious, in this moment, in this environment, how you feel about that.
Well, I'm attentive.
That now.
Look, I'm attentive to the rise of anti-Semitism, which we've seen, and an environment that makes it easier for that rise to take place, that spawns it, even if not promoting it and sponsoring specifically, creates an environment where it becomes an easier thing to do. And I'm alert to it. I'll take you back to that commercial that I saw. I saw that commercial because that was played everywhere. That was the 2.5-minute long commercial. That was the last one. And I almost fell off my chair. I fell off because I was in it, not because I didn't really think of myself, nor did I really think of Janet Yellen as spokesman and the face of Judaism. I didn't even think of that at all. It didn't occur to me at all. I was thinking, why am I in that commercial for that? But after the fact, I heard all of that, and I thought of it. And so, yes, it's something that I would think about it, but I don't automatically jump. Look, the president, who I knew, not super friendly, but New York is a small town in some ways, so we engage and we cross paths. I know his kids. I don't really, if I were popping into my mind, who was I worried personally? And I wouldn't necessarily have picked the Trumps, who, as you know, are his daughter and grandkids, Jewish. So I don't want to attribute motivation or what somebody thinks. I'm not in a position to do that. But if you're asking me, as you did, what I thought, that didn't occur to me at first. But I do think that this administration has been playing to some of the, the baser instincts of kind of fringy elements. And you can say that, that anti-Semitism has been a kind of an element of that portfolio. And so, yes, it occurs to me that he's feeding the beast a bit, even if he's not doing it intentionally.
Is it true that Goldman would not do business with Donald Trump?
I can't say over the long period, but it didn't come up. I think the president tended to trade. It didn't even come up. I wouldn't have been dying. He had a history of his companies have defaulted on things. If there was a security and instrument of a company that was good, we probably did it, but we were never his partners. I think he dealt with smaller institutions or a big institution like Deutsche Bank in the US, which I wouldn't call a frontline US institution. So it didn't really come up that much. But I would have, I think a lot of his enterprises didn't do so well, and that would have informed our judgment.
So what are you going to do next?
I'm going to go home and leave. I'm sorry, in general? I don't know. I'm open to say, everybody asks that, and I realize it's one, sometimes people will send me an email from time to time if something's going on, how's it going? And I realize they only have to type a few letters, and they expect paragraphs and paragraphs from me. I don't have it to go, so you can say, what are you doing? What are you going to do next? I'm still kind of doing this. I'm chairmaning. We had board meetings last week. There are things that come up. So I'm still doing stuff. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to be so hard on myself. It's been 4 weeks now, and I have 8 weeks left of being chairman, so I'll find something.
Let me ask you a different way. I was thinking of actually companies that have lived through crises or are living through crises today, given your experience. I'm actually curious if you've got any phone calls. Would you ever take, or what kind of advice, I was going to say, would you take a board position on a Facebook today, or a Google today, or any of the tech companies today? But even if you didn't.
No, I would, the answer is.
I was going to say, what would you tell them?
Look, I learned a lot of stuff over the time, and you learn a lot of stuff about yourself that you didn't know. I didn't know I had a thick skin, apparently I do. It doesn't mean that stuff didn't bother me, because it did. But I didn't dissolve when things were going like that. And by the way, I observed some people who did dissolve. You learn a lot of stuff. And the short answer to your question is yes. I'd be a happy advisor. And I joke to some people under stress would call me, and I said, I have a gift. And that gift is I can make anybody feel better by comparison. Because of the stuff that we went through in the long period that we were twisting. And I said, and it's a joke, but there was something to it. I mean, there's hardly anybody could come up with a storyline or a situation where I can't outdo them. And then having established my credentials and our affiliation and our affinity, I can then switch into trying to advise them, which I've tried to do.
What have you told them? Any tech companies call?
Maybe.
What would be your...
What I meant by that is companies have called. I can't tell today who's a tech company and who isn't.
Ooh, okay, different question. If Mark Zuckerberg called you today, what would you tell him?
What would I tell him? I'd say, Your Worship, what a great job you've done. Because he's been very influential. But one of the things I would say is, sometimes it's better. People always say, what should I major in, what should I do? And I said, read history, because there are cycles. And it's good to know economics, it's good to take courses in business, maybe, but knowing the humanities, knowing how people think, and knowing the cycles of history is helpful. If you know history, you know that the culture of this country and most democracies are brittle if there are pockets of influence that threaten the influence of elected representatives. And that was the case for Standard Oil, and that was the case for IBM, that was the case for AT&T, and I don't want to flatter ourselves, but we were portrayed of being very, very influential, and I'd say the body politic resents that and finds mechanisms for curtailing that influence, and maybe it's a good thing in the long run for the Republic, but that happens, and it may take antitrust, it may be national security, it may be privacy concerns, it may be that they get, they get dust on their white gloves when they feel around, but you can always find a reason to reassert the influence of elected bodies if unelected bodies become too powerful.
Thank you, Lloyd. Let's take a couple of quick questions, because I know there's some out there. I see one hand right there, and maybe we'll do one more, because I know we've gone over time.
Sorry.
No, it's my fault.
Mr. Blankfein, my name is Carol Lamberg. I just wonder if you maintain a positive attitude about public housing.
About public housing?
Public housing.
Very much. I actually spent some time looking at what's going on in New York City with the monitor. It's a very strange situation where there's a tiff over who's accountable, control, or who should pay for things as between the governor and the mayor, but it was the US government that sued, and it's the federal prosecutors who have the right to appoint a monitor. So look at the complexity of that. You have the state involved, the city involved, and the federal government involved, none of whom has enough money to make the slightest dent into the needs. Again, I grew up in public housing, but I grew up in public housing when the houses were new. I bet they haven't done a thing to my apartment from when I left it in the 1960s. And people without heat, and it's a tragic situation. And something, we're gonna have to think of a range of things of how to sort that out, up to and including asking the question, should the government be involved in providing housing as opposed to just creating an environment where people who are in that business can do it? Because if you work for the government and you have to have a public service union contracting for maintenance and delivering those services in a public context, maybe it's better for an independent private interest to contract with the city to provide it in some way or to be stimulated to do that. But it's a very big thing, and keep watching this space because it's going to be, winter is coming, and I bet it's going to get cold, and I bet there's going to be a lot of people who are not going to have heat during the coldest parts of the winter, and we're going to be hearing about that. It's going to be painful to observe.
Let's sneak in one final question. Sir in the front, right here.
I think that's the most stressful policy issue affecting this city.
You said you learned from history, and so how do you distill what parts of history are more likely to repeat themselves and what's more like noise?
Well, the original quote I gave you was that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. That was the thing. So I think nothing quite. Look, it's just the same thing. People come to me all the time. Look, I was in the risk business, and so everyone's showing you a chart. This is what happened in from 1930 to 1939. What's the relevance? It's not irrelevant. It's not that relevant. People say to me, "Oh, millennials are so different." It's a complete break. This is the apotheosis of of evolution in this generation? I said, yes, yes, of course it's different. Everything is different, but something not that different. People get to a certain age, you may job hop for a very long time, but at some time people they form households, you have kids, people want stability, and guess what? They want to, people become more and more like their parents than they ever thought they would, and that happens in the human, cycle of generations, and it's also the cycle in financial affairs, and by the way, it's also the cycle in political affairs. People said, oh my God, the politics are so poison, it's never been this bad. And I said, well, we did have a civil war. And they said, well, that was a long time ago. And then I said, well, we had a McCarthy era. We put people in concentration camps because they got scared in World War II. We had the government shut, we've had tense politics, and people say, oh, it's never been this dangerous. But I'm old enough to have watched Kennedy at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis when it was DEFCON 2 and the US was stopping Russian warships in international waters. These cycles repeat, and I think sometimes it's reassuring that somehow the human race has muddled through, but doesn't make you complacent not to solve the problems. And every generation, every current problems are always worse than the ones you read about, because the ones you read about have been resolved. And there's nothing that's been resolved that ever is as much a threat as something that's still open today.
Lloyd Blankfein, everybody. Thank you.